The Aboriginal and once most prominent inhabitants of North America, Indigenous people now only make up a mere 0.9% of the American population. With European arrival in America, Indigenous people have had their own lands usurped and have had to clash against the struggle to preserve their cultures. This struggle has presented harsh repercussions on Native American communities. As a result of federal mistreatment against Indigenous people, throughout history they have struggled to fit into American society and continue to face hardships. European colonization of the Americas began in the 15th century. The three most prominent European colonizers were Spain, France, and England. Spanish motive for colonization was God, gold, and glory. The Spanish sought to conquer Indigenous people, convert them to Catholicism, and use them as slaves and as cheap labor. French interaction with natives approached an attitude of allyship, as the French participated in the fur trade with them. Originally, Indigenous people had lifestyles based on subsistence farming and often had a heavy focus on nature and respecting it. The English had brief cooperation with natives, but as they forced European ideals more and more onto them, things took a turn for the worse. Overall, Europeans claimed American land as their own and brought diseases and violence that diminished native lifestyles and population. Eventually, the British became the primary power holders in America, and violence between natives and Americans ensued. Natives were discriminated against, and many Americans marked them as savages, and developed an attitude of driving away natives from their own lands and pushing them westward. The Jacksonian era issued even more federal mistreatment against Indigenous people. Under Andrew Jackson, the Indian Removal Act of 1830 was introduced. Jackson sympathized with American citizens who yearned for settlement in native land. He believed the most humane option was to compel Native Americans to leave the land. In his second address to Congress, he referred to natives as savages and believed removal was generous as an alternative to utter annihilation. Jackson's native policies earned him the name the Indian Killer. There were nearly 400 treaties, and they were almost always unequal as they catered to the benefit of American citizens. Tribes were forced to resettle into the barren land in the Indian Territory, which is now present-day Oklahoma. Most eastern tribes reluctantly complied to the forced resettlement. The BIA, or Bureau of Indian Affairs, was created to oversee the removal and handle relations with Native Americans. This series of relocations is referred to as the Trail of Tears. Georgia and other states created laws requiring natives to move west. This was challenged in the courts in Cherokee Nation 1831. The court stated that the tribe was not a foreign nation with the ability to sue in federal court. However, the second case ruled that Georgia and the states have no force in the territory. Jackson sided with the states and the forced removal continued. Most Cherokees fought back, and by 1838, the U.S. military had forced 100,000 plus Indigenous people west of Mississippi and out of Georgia into barren, mostly unfertile land in Oklahoma. About 1 in 3 people died from disease, starvation, exposure, and attacks from whites. Overall, there were thousands of deaths. Solomon Carnes, 57-year-old full-blood Choctaw native at Atoka, Mississippi, has had his removal story documented. After removal, he lived near Bentley, Oklahoma. In 1898, Congress had made a treaty with Choctaw and Chickasaw natives and had passed an act allowing all other Choctaw natives in other states to relocate and reside in Choctaw, Chickasaw, Mississippi country for a year. In 1904, there were about 450 Choctaws established at Muskogee. They were hauled into boxcars in Mississippi and led out at Atoka to be established in camps 3 miles southwest. They were kept for 4 months in the camp and supplied with a few things until native families decided where they would allot. Their land rights would be even further diminished throughout the years. A form of systematic discrimination Indigenous people face is the blood quantum. It's very controversial, and it marked the level of Indian blood an individual held. It was applied in law more prominently around the 20th century, and it was a system the federal government placed onto tribes to determine which tribe members would receive allotments to lands. It also restricted who could be a citizen of a tribe and receive tribal benefits. The Department of the Interior gives a certificate of degree of Indian blood, which is similar to an ID card. The percentage of Indian blood was discerned through use of tribal documents. The people determining who had full blood quantum were often unfamiliar with native ways. People were often marked full blood based on appearance or level of involvement in cultural communities, so it was not always biologically sound. In fact, when the full blood roll was given, freedmen black people living as natives were often excluded. Even if they were mixed, they were listed on a separate roll due to their appearance because of the one-drop rule, where one black ancestor listed you as black. Many see it as enduring colonial oppression, as the blood quantum measures through a construct of race, so that as natives breed themselves out, the American government could eventually get rid of their treaty responsibilities. It is still used in many tribes for citizenship requirements today, like the Navajo Nation, but different point of views on the subject exist within communities. The blood quantum has made many feel that they struggle to fit in. Many go through an internal fight to be seen as Indigenous through their physical features because their identity is quantified. There is often pressure to only have children with other Native Americans to preserve bloodline qualifications and further solidify their identities. Many feel that it divides Native Americans and diminishes them to numerical values. Some tribes, such as the Muskogee Creek Nation, limit some authority positions within the tribe to full-bloods, despite full-bloods being a very small percentage of the total tribe population. This takes away the voices of many tribe citizens. Another way Indigenous people felt like they didn't fit in is when the American Indian Urban Relocation Act of the 1950s was instituted. The 1953 Indian Termination Act was a new policy by the federal government that diminished government support for Indian tribes and their rights to their lands. Now, the federal policy was more geared towards termination of reservations and relocation. In response, the BIA started a 20-year urban relocation plan where they gave assistance with housing and employment. Native Americans struggled to adjust to life in the city as industrialist society was vastly different from thousands of years of subsistence farming and rural lifestyles. This caused unemployment, discrimination, loss of culture from being isolated from communities, and homesick feelings. They were also often unable to return to reservations. When the BIA started the urban relocation program, only 8% of Native Americans lived in cities. The 2010 census found that 78% live off reservations now. Those who left felt they didn't fit in comparison to those who stayed on the reservations because cities created cultural isolation. Indigenous communities continue to struggle in certain ways. In every age group below 35, the violent crime rate was higher for Indigenous people than for every other ethnic group. The murder rate for women is 10 times greater than the national average. Physical violence, rape, or stalking by an intimate partner rate is among the highest in the United States, and at some point, 1 in 3 Native American women may experience the trauma and violence of rape. The rate of adolescents who engage in underage drinking is the highest of all ethnic groups. The poverty rate is at 26.2%, which is considerably higher than the white poverty rate, which is 8.1%. Indigenous people have had to fight against federal and colonial hostility in a struggle to fit in throughout history, and the ramifications of this mistreatment have caused hardships present in Indigenous communities today. Through federal laws and views perpetrated through acts such as the Indian Removal Act of 1830 and the 1950s Indian Urban Relocation, Native Americans have had their lands and resources taken from their grasps. They have faced quarrels such as the blood quantum, and racist depictions of them have harmed their cultural identities for centuries. Treatment of their communities has come a long way since colonial rule through activism and many acts that extended their rights, like the Tribal Self-Governance Act of 1994, which allowed tribes to have greater control over their own lands. However, statistics show that Native American communities continue to struggle in certain ways. Despite this struggle, we have observed growing justice for them in modern America. Progress is being made. In fact, Congresswoman Deb Haaland, if she is confirmed, will be the first Indigenous person to lead the Department of the Interior. There have been and will continue to be many strides made toward burgeoning the growth of Aboriginal communities. Here's some info about the song that was playing in the background.